It's the Worldwide Sports Radio Network. Your premier source for sports news and analysis in Oregon and Washington. Live on the Worldwide Sports Radio Network.
What is up? Welcome to the Pacific Northwest Sports Radio Show, brought to you by the Worldwide Sports Radio Network. I am your host, Andy Patton. You can find me on Twitter at Andy Patton PNW, and you can find the Worldwide Sports Radio Network on Twitter as well at WWSRN_radio. You can also listen to this show and all of the other great shows on the Worldwide Sports Radio Network by downloading their app, which is available on iOS and Android at WWSRN. It also features written work by many of the radio hosts, including yours truly. I wrote a piece just recently about Blake Snell and whether the Seattle Mariners should pursue him as a trade target. You can read that on the WWSRN app, also on their website, WWSRN.com. It's a great piece, I think, talks about some of the things I talked about in last week's episode, for those of you who may have missed it, about the Mariners and their offseason plans and whether Blake Snell is a player that could fit into them. So check that out. There will be plenty more written content from yours truly. And again, many other fantastic shows on the Sports Radio Network that you guys can listen to as well. All right, moving on. Today is episode 6 of the Pacific Northwest Sports Radio Show. And it was a better week than it was last week for sports in the Pacific Northwest. Depending on your fandom, obviously it was not a better week for the Seattle Sounders, who unfortunately lost in the MLS Cup by a score of 3-0 to the Columbus Crew, ending what would have been another spectacular bid for an MLS Cup trophy. I kind of had a planned segment discussing their kind of legacy and overall dynasty as compared to other dominant sports in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in Seattle. How do they stack up to the early 2000 or early 2010 Seahawks? How do they stack up to the Seattle Storm, the mid 90s Mariners, etc., etc.? I still hope to do a segment like that because losing in the championship game is still a pretty darn good result. And obviously the Sounders have had massive amounts of success for a very long period of time. But today I decided to focus on other stuff. The Pac-12 regular season is the first topic. It's mercifully over. It was a disaster. We're going to talk a lot about that in a second with football, though basketball hasn't been a whole lot better. The Seahawks absolutely pounded the Jets 40-3, an absolute destruction of that team on Sunday. The Blazers are set to start their season almost exactly 1 week from today. I think we are nine days out as of this recording right now. Against the Utah Jazz on December 23rd is when they get started. And for today, I am so excited to be joined later in the show by Maura Dooley. Maura works for 710 ESPN. She and I are going to break down the Seahawks and their win over the Jets. We're going to talk about some playoff scenarios for this team. We're going to talk about the return of Josh Gordon. We're going to talk about how dope Jamal Adams is. We're also going to talk about her time as the sideline reporter for the XFL Seattle Dragons, the short-lived but hopefully returning XFL team that we saw and had a lot of fun, I think, watching in February and March, obviously before their season was cut short by the pandemic. She also hosts a fantasy football advice show for any of you who are still alive in the fantasy football playoffs. If you are looking for help for your roster, stick it out. We will talk about that probably an hour or so. Maybe you guys can even ask some questions and get some fantasy football advice from her. Anywho, before we get into all of that, we've got to talk about this Pac-12 football situation, just the absolute chaos that has ensued. Starting, obviously for the world, starting months and months ago, and pretty much starting around then for the Pac-12 as well. They haven't really gotten anything together this entire season, and it has showed in a lack of preparation for how this was going to shake out. At first when college football was kind of nearing its return and we were coming up to September and it was kind of unclear what teams were going to do, it appeared the Pac-12 was maybe making the safer choice by opting not to play right away. We saw SEC, ACC, handful of other conferences opt to play right away or not quite right away, but pretty soon after the season was expected to start, we saw some conferences like Ivy and other leagues that just opted not to play at all. We saw some that kind of waited a little bit. We saw the Big Ten obviously started a week before the Pac-12, but it was tough because it looked like the Pac-12, like waiting might have been the right decision, but it wasn't waiting. What they should have done potentially is just cancel the entire season or play right away. Those probably would have been the best two scenarios. Doing this weird middle ground had some predictably bad consequences. And a lot of the things that we've seen shake out, we kind of could have predicted. At least I did. I think a lot of other people did too. What ended up happening is when you don't build in enough breaks in the schedule, you don't build in enough games, there was always going to be tight because they were only scheduled to play 7 games anyway. And you don't build in any opportunities for them to reschedule any of these games. Obviously, part of the Pac-12 struggle was that they were in states that have more stringent rules preventing traveling out of state and more contact tracing rules. And these aren't bad things. I'm not saying these as criticisms. I'm saying that the SEC was able to play football easier because they were in states that had less restrictions about COVID. That's not a good thing. That's, in fact, a bad thing. But it was a hurdle that the Pac-12 needed to find a way to get over, and they failed. They did not do that. It was apparent from the 3 days before the first game of the season when Cal had one positive test at California, and that was enough. That was enough for them to not be able to travel to Seattle to play the University of Washington. That canceled the first game of the season, and predictably it didn't get better. I don't see how people thought, oh, well, that's just a blip in the radar. No, it's going to get ugly, and it got ugly. I think one of my favorite facts from this season was the fact that USC, when playing their third game of the year, was playing a team that was playing their first game every single week. The first game of the year, they played Arizona State. Arizona State was obviously playing their season opener as well. Week 2, USC played Arizona, who was playing their first game of the season. Week 3, USC played Utah, who was also playing in their first game of the season. So we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but we're talking about the only good team in the Pac-12 being a 5-0 USC team that had that as an advantage going their way. So we just ended up with these ludicrous results. And then the most recent update, again, obviously this is live and things have been changing pretty much by the minute. So who knows how dated this will sound as soon as potentially tomorrow. But as of right now, USC is scheduled to play Oregon in the Pac-12 championship. The reason for that is that while Washington won the Pac-12 North, the positive tests that they have indicate that they will not have a full enough roster to be able to play USC on Friday evening when the game is scheduled. So the Pac-12, unlike any other conference in college football, I want to make that very clear, has opted, instead of just calling this game a no contest, they will then just pick the runner-up. So the Ducks, who were 3-2 this season, who lost to Oregon State and Cal in back-to-back weeks, who don't look like one of the best teams in the conference, are now going to play USC for the championship. A 3-2 Oregon team who beat Stanford, UCLA, and Washington State. Now, grant, like UW was 3-1. And the controversy, I was going to say when the controversy started, it's been controversial for months. I don't think that there's any specific point in time, but the biggest controversy lately has been this Pac-12 North champion, and specifically the fact that Washington and Oregon were scheduled to play each other last week. That game would have determined the Pac-12 North champion. Had Oregon won, they would have moved to 4-2 on the season, while UW would have been 3-2. So Oregon would have won. Had UW won, they would have both been 3-2, but UW obviously would have had the tiebreaker. Or excuse me. Yes. Yeah, that's right. So we have a situation where UW couldn't play that game and said, sorry, we're out. And then that left the standings where UW, who played one less game than Oregon, had a better winning percentage and was therefore crowned the Pac-12 North champion. Just understandably upset a lot of Oregon fans. And I get it. Like I saw a lot of this. I saw a lot of the vitriol on Twitter and people mad at UW. First of all, calling them like scared or that they were running away or anything like that is asinine and just dumb. Like it's not accurate. They were unable to field a team. They were following within the rules of the Pac-12. I don't think challenging UW. I think that this notion that has been spread, Dabo Swinney at Clemson was a big part of this as well. Anytime that insinuate either directly or indirectly that a team is using COVID-19 to get out of playing games or because they're scared, I think is extremely dangerous and disingenuous and really kind of intolerable, like unacceptable language to use. If dumb fans on Twitter do it, it doesn't matter. Sorry if you're one of those dumb fans who said that. I sympathize with your frustration with the situation, but that's not what's happening. UW wants to play this football game. They wanted to play that football game. Yes, they also wanted to win the Pac-12 North, and that was a byproduct that ultimately ended up being irrelevant because they're not going to play in the Pac-12 championship anyway. But for those few days when UW was the Pac-12 North champion and was slated to play USC, they weren't celebrating because they got away with it, because they didn't have to play Oregon. They're celebrating because they went 3-1 and Oregon went 3-2. They won a higher percentage of their games than the Ducks did. Would they have lost to Oregon? I have no idea. Maybe. Oregon's pretty good. Oregon also just lost to Oregon State and Cal, two not very good teams, two teams that UW is better than. So I don't know. This whole sentiment that, oh, they're scared, whatever. I think I'd have taken UW. I think they would have won that game. But regardless, the sentiment that these teams are scared or that they don't want to play these games and that they're using this as some kind of excuse is really, like I said, disingenuous. It's offensive in a way. I understand that many of these college athletes who are testing positive are likely asymptomatic. We don't know the full story on that, obviously, and I'm not going to comment on any specific situations. We don't really know a lot about that, but based on just kind of general population numbers, these are high-level athletes who are in their early 20s who are likely recovering fine. Many of them are probably asymptomatic. The ones who are showing symptoms are most likely going to recover and be okay. Of course, we also don't know the long-term effects of this disease. We don't know how many of them could develop symptoms like myocarditis and other things like that, or who may be at risk of exposing family members, things like that. But beyond that, like, we're in the middle of a public health crisis. We're in the middle of a pandemic that is worse than it was in March. Things are not better than they were then. And so when these teams are trying to be careful, they're not all perfect. They're still college kids. They're making mistakes. They're doing things like that. But at the end of the day, they want to play football, and it is a difficult for them to have to not play football because of this, because they don't have enough guys, because of the contract tracing. I'm sure they're frustrated. I'm sure it's very frustrating to find out that one guy, either on accident, I mean, it's always on accident. You're not trying to get this disease on purpose, but either just because they happen to test positive or because they did go out and party potentially, one guy shuts down like an entire defensive line. Like, everybody on your defensive line is now no longer eligible to play in the game because one guy tested positive. I'm sure that's very frustrating. I would imagine that's really tough, but it's not following it up by saying that they're scared or that they're doing this intentionally or that they didn't want to play the game is not helping the situation. And it's just diluting what's actually happening. And it's dismissing this really serious situation. I get it. It's frustrating when you have the disease, all of your teammates around you don't have it. All of you feel fine. Nobody seems sick. I get it. I would imagine that's really frustrating, but it is in everybody's best interest to continue to be very, very safe. We're not in a situation where we're just canceling games, which I could talk a lot longer about how continuing to play football when this virus got so bad this winter, things that were predicted in March that it was going to get really bad because of the cold weather, because of family gatherings for holidays. We kind of knew this was going to happen. We continued to soldier on and play football through it. And then we continued to be stringent about not breaking those rules or not allowing teams to play if they have positive tests. So all of that combination, along with the fact that the Pac-12 did not build in any bye weeks, that they're in states that could have basically shut you down from traveling right away, that it took them, I think, a month into a 6-week season to finally allow teams to play non-conference games, which I believe only one team took advantage of in Colorado, who played San Diego State and won. It's just a mess, and it predictably ends with this kind of chaos where you have a not very good 5-0 USC team waiting to find out if they're going to play a 3-1 UW team that really kind of lucked into being a Pac-12 North champion, or a 3-2 Oregon team that faded at the end of the year. And of course they get Oregon, who didn't even win the Pac-12 North, a team that just doesn't really deserve to be here. And then on top of all of that, you have this Colorado squad this up-and-coming team coached by Carl Durrell, who was kind of expected to not be really big players in the conference this year. And all of a sudden, they go 4-1. They have a pretty good year. They didn't get to play USC because that was one of the games that was canceled. But they beat UCLA. They beat Stanford. They beat Arizona. They lost to Utah, but they also beat San Diego State, a pretty darn good non-conference opponent. And they're just SOL. There's nothing they can do. They were pretty, I think, demonstrably the second best team in the conference. I think UW fans may contest that because Colorado didn't beat anybody great, although I think UCLA is pretty good and Stanford's decent, and Stanford obviously beat the University of Washington. But, University of Washington also beat Utah, who Colorado lost to. So it's just all sorts of chaos. But the fact of the matter is that Colorado doesn't even get a shot here. They get nothing. They finished 4-1, and that's just it. That's what happens to them. And meanwhile, these two teams in Oregon and Washington who really don't deserve to be there get to play this USC team that, again, deserves to be there. I've been kind of bagging on USC for not being very good this year, and I stand by that. I watched every minute, every single play of every USC game because one of my other freelance gigs is covering them for Trojans Wire through USA Today. And they're not great. They have obvious flaws. I think when they put it all together, they can be very good. And we saw that in spurts against UCLA in their last game. And there's a chance if they kind of ride that momentum that they'll absolutely crush the Oregon Ducks on Friday. In fact, I kind of think that's potentially likely. But at the end of the day, the problem here is that Colorado doesn't get a shot. And USC is forced to, now they know, but they found out today, Monday at I think 1 or 2 in the afternoon. They found out today who they're playing. Meanwhile, Oregon and Washington both knew last week when that game got canceled. All we have to do now is prepare for USC. We watch film, we watch tape. We got to watch the game live last week against UCLA, most likely. So they get 2 weeks. They get a long break, and they get this really lengthy period of time where all they have to do is study USC. Meanwhile, USC comes off a short week and then finds out 5 days before their game that who they're going to play. That is really unfortunate, and that's a situation that I think we're not talking about enough when we talk about the UW and Oregon and kind of this whole fiasco and the UW being afraid and all the kind of shenanigans that we've seen on social media and that you guys have probably talked about at work and things like that. I think one situation that we're kind of ignoring is that USC is kind of getting the shaft here. This is not a great situation for them. You have one undefeated team. Your only shot at a college football playoff. I don't think USC is going to get there, but you're really your only very good team. Colorado's fine and they're ranked, but they should get a shot to play USC. I've said that a handful of times. I still believe that, but at the end of the day, USC is the team that the Pac-12 should be trying to help, and instead they're screwing them by saying, "Well, you're going to play one of these two teams. We'll find out on Monday which team it's going to be, and by the way, they've had 10 days to prepare for you, and you are coming off a short week." It's just a bummer of a situation. I think USC is better than both University of Washington and Oregon. I don't think that they're dramatically better than either team talent-wise. They have a great offense. Obviously, Keaton Slovis has looked phenomenal this year. They have 4 great receivers in Drake London and Brew McCoy and Amon-Ra St. Brown and Tyler Vaughns. And I think that they're going to have a lot of success in this game. Oregon's defense has looked pretty bad this year, like very bad, surprisingly bad, considering they have a lot of potential first or second round talent on the defensive line and just on the defense in general. UW is better defensively, DBU, Elijah Molden, they have a lot of success in the secondary, so they may actually match up a little bit better against USC. In my mind, I think UW would be more of a challenge for the Trojans, but at the end of the day, this is a USC team that is now kind of forced to scramble and prepare for an Oregon squad that they didn't really have any plans to play this entire season, and now all of a sudden they have just 5 days to figure out a game plan. The other things to talk about here, there's a lot going on in the Pac-12 right now. We didn't even get to basketball. Maybe we will here at the end, but Colorado not getting their opportunity, the Pac just straight up refusing to allow the two best teams to play each other, keeping up with a tradition, and I say that in air quotes, about having the Pac-12 North champion play the Pac-12 South champion. I don't know about you guys, but I'm old enough, and many of you who are younger than me are old enough to remember when this wasn't how the Pac-12 did it. It's not like this is some long-standing tradition from when the guys were playing each other in the 40s. This isn't that long of a tradition. It's very, very recent. I think it's less than 10 years old that the Pac-12 North and Pac-12 South have even been divided, for starters, and that they've insisted that these two teams that are the winners of each of those divisions be the guys who play each other. This just isn't this sacred thing that I think that they need to hold true. And then on top of that, like I mentioned before, every other conference in college basketball isn't doing this. Every other one. The Pac-12 is the only conference that is insisting this happen. There are likely a lot of reasons for that. One, I think perhaps most notable, the conference knew that Oregon and Washington, for that matter, were going to make better television against USC than Colorado. That is an unfortunate reality that we're dealing with here, that Oregon and Washington, outside of USC, are probably the most notable college football programs in the Pac-12. Not probably, they are. They are the most notable college football programs in the country, in the conference. And either one of them playing USC just makes better television. It's a more compelling story. There's more interest in it. Colorado is kind of this rising up-and-comer team. I think a lot of people don't necessarily know if we should really believe in them. Like I said, they're 4-1. They've beat some not very good Pac-12 teams. They weren't expected to be good. They don't have this huge following yet. So I kind of think they were like, let's see if we can maybe push them out. And this was a convenient way to just say, no, we're sticking with the rules. We're not going to change things up. And oh darn, I guess that means USC plays one of the two most notable programs in the conference, even if they're not very good and not as good as Colorado. It's hard to say. I mean, if Colorado and Oregon played head to head, I think I'd probably bet on Oregon, assuming health for both sides and everything. But the fact of the matter is, Colorado's 4-1, Oregon's 3-2. Colorado should have gotten that shot, and they're not getting it. And like I said, they're just done. That is a massive bummer. I'd be mad. I'd be mad if I was them. This is the thing that's so problematic about this is everybody's mad. Everybody's mad. USC's mad because they don't get enough time to prepare for their game. Colorado's mad because they don't get a chance to play. UW is mad because they were getting yelled at for being like cheats when they were just trying to follow the rules. And now they don't get to play in the Pac-12 championship, even though they won the Pac-12 North. Oregon is probably not as mad now. I think they're a little bit more tight-lipped than they were, but they were mad. They were super mad because they thought they weren't going to get a chance to play because UW didn't play that game last week. Meanwhile, you have teams like Washington State that didn't get very many games in, that didn't get to play the Apple Cup. I'm sure they're not happy about that. Utah didn't play till the third week of the season. That's upsetting. They kind of finally found their stride right at the end of the year. Way too late for that to be a thing. It's just, nobody's happy. This didn't go well for anybody. The Pac-12 just kind of butchered it from the start. They fired a lot of people in the Pac-12 network, which was a abhorrent decision because people losing their jobs in the middle of a pandemic sucks. But they did that kind of with the seeming intention of not playing football at all this year. Then all of a sudden they did play football. Then they didn't have a way to stream a lot of games. So it's been difficult to watch games. It's been a mess. Larry Scott and the commissioner's office in the Pac-12 has been bad for years. It shows up most primarily in the horrible officiating, which of course has been a part of this year as well. But it's a poorly run conference. Larry Scott has done very little to help this conference in his time as the commissioner. And I'm not saying it's easy to be the commissioner of a conference this year. It's really hard. And they had to make some really hard decisions. And some of the things the Pac-12 did, I kind of understand their thought process behind it, even if it didn't quite go the way that they hoped that it would. But many of the decisions, particularly lately, have been baffling. And this rigid decision to stick to their Pac-12 North versus Pac-12 South with the very obvious notion that it's for money reasons and for television reasons is just sad and frustrating for everybody involved. And I, for one, I'm pretty glad that the season is about to be over. It wasn't particularly enjoyable football to watch for the most part. Obviously, we saw some fun things. I think I'll try to end here on a little bit of a positive note. For one, I don't think any coaches are getting fired. I think that kind of was secured just by the simple fact that the season was so short and so weird and so many games got canceled. And how can you really judge a coach too aggressively for what happened this year? So I think that kind of helps. But I think some of the things that we were concerned about before the year like specifically UW fans were concerned about, maybe, is Jimmy Lake going to be able to take over and be solid in place of Chris Peterson? And what about the offensive coordinator, John Donovan, who people didn't really like and were pretty concerned about? And UW's offense hasn't been great, but it's better than I thought it was going to be. And the defense looks fantastic. That's not really a shock. They had some bad games, UW did, but for the most part, I think they have a solid team. I'm excited about the future for the University of Washington. Same with the Oregon State. Jonathan Smith, he was a quarterback there a long time ago. I remember when he was there, and his tenure here has been, we haven't quite seen a lot yet, but I like what we saw from them this year. I think they're a program on the rise, and that's much needed for the Beavers. They haven't been a program on the rise in a really long time, and I think to see kind of their sister school in Washington State finally take that leap with Coach Leach and be a nationally ranked team and a program that was, in line for some really very good bowl games and had 2 quarterbacks go to the NFL back to back and things like that. I think that probably really hurt the Beavers because they were the program that was still on the outside looking in. And now, like, all 3 of the other programs in the Pacific Northwest were high players and ranked and, very competitive, and Oregon State still wasn't there. And so I hope, for their sake, I hope that they're turning the corner. I think it would be fun to see Oregon and Oregon State really have this legitimate rivalry. Obviously, Oregon State winning the game this year helps quite a bit, certainly makes it more interesting. So I'm kind of excited about their future. UW, I'm excited about. Washington State, I just don't know enough. Nick Rolovich is certainly different than Mike Leach. Most college coaches, most coaches of football in general are different than Mike Leach, for better or for worse. But I think that Washington State, they put themselves on the map. They're going to get recruits for probably another few years because of that. Rolovich is a good recruiter. So I think that they might be a program on the ups as well. We didn't really see much of it this year, but that's kind of true of every program. And then you have the Ducks. Again, I said I was going to end on a positive note, but maybe not so much on the Ducks, who've lost 2 in a row. I know there have been some fans who've been calling for Coach Cristobal, people who are upset with the defensive coordinator, Andy Avalos, and I get that. I think calling for Cristobal is insane. I think he needs to stick around, and they should attempt to keep him around for a long time, especially now that the Auburn job is available. But the defensive coordinator, this is a team that had a lot of promise on defense, and they gave up a lot of points this season. A lot of points. And I think fans a lot of times tried to blame Tyler Shuck for some of Oregon's losses, particularly the Oregon State game. And Shuck didn't have a great game, but they gave up like 40 points to Oregon State, who, again, like I said, is kind of on the rise. But you shouldn't be giving up 40 points to anybody. The talent that Oregon has on that defensive line, and again, just on the defense in general, you should not be giving up 40 points to anybody, particularly not a team like Oregon State. And for them to do that is a pretty scathing indictment of the defensive schemes that they run and the packages that they were using. And again, it's hard to judge too much this year because they had less time to prepare. They may have had guys who were unable to play because of COVID protocol. All of that stuff is a factor and should be strongly weighed when teams are making decisions about coaches. But I would think that if there's any coordinator outside of Kevin Sumlin at Arizona, who already lost his job after Arizona's lost like 10 or something games in a row, dating back to last season, sure, that makes sense. I think that's acceptable. But I think that Oregon, if they wanted to look for another defensive coordinator, I get it. I understand why that might be a move that they attempt to make. But this season was just kind of such a crapshoot that it's really hard to judge too much anyway. Couple more things on Pac-12 basketball before we take a quick break, because I did want to touch on it really quick, because college basketball, I feel like I've only talked about the Zags so far, and obviously the Zags have not played in a very long time and will not play again until Saturday when they play Iowa, who is number 3 in the country right now, could be number 2 by the time that game rolls around. I'm not sure, but until then, we don't have much to talk about with them. Pac-12 right now is kind of weird. Shocker, right? It's been a weird year for everything. So, of course, Pac-12 basketball has been strange. Right now, the 2 undefeated teams are Arizona, which is not as surprising. They're 5-0. And Washington State. Your Washington State Cougars are 4-0. Granted, they haven't played anybody, and they barely beat Idaho, who is not very good. But it's still funny to look at the standings and see that those are your 2 teams that are on top. Oregon and USC are both 4-1. UCLA is 5-1. The Trojans had a great opportunity to play Stanford early in the year, potentially get a big win over the Cardinal. Of course, that game was canceled because of COVID-19, specifically with the Trojans, which could impact some of their games down the line. It's just going to be messy. It's going to be messy, just like it has been all season long for football. I don't think it's going to get better for college basketball. I hope that you're not optimistic that it's going to get better. I think we're going to see a lot of similar things. Obviously, there are less athletes for basketball, which means less players who could potentially test positive. It also means it takes less players for there to be an inability to play a basketball game. So we'll kind of have to see. I'm planning to talk more about Pac-12 basketball as the season gets going, but again, I think that it will unfortunately be a lot of similar conversations. All right, so I'm going to take a quick break, but when I get back, I will be joined by Maura Dooley to discuss the absolute ass whooping that the Seahawks gave the Jets on Sunday, as well as some just general notes on the team about Russell Wilson's performance, about Geno Smith's performance, because we get to talk about that, and some potential playoff scenarios. Stay tuned.
It's the Worldwide Sports Radio Network. You're listening to the Pacific Northwest Sports Radio Show on the Worldwide Sports Radio Network.
All right, welcome back. While we wait for Maura Dooley to show up, I'm going to talk a little bit about this Seahawks game. It's really nice, really nice for Seattle fans to not have to watch the fourth quarter. Like, that's really fun. I think it's been, God, it feels like it's been years since the Seahawks truly blew a team out like this. And I know that Seattle has this reputation under Coach Pete Carroll of really playing down to their opponents, which is so frustrating. It's so frustrating for fans. It's frustrating, I'm sure, for the players. And I'm sure it's frustrating for the coaches. I know it doesn't seem like it. It seems like Pete Carroll and their staff just like adore close games. Like, that's what they want to play in. And I think there's a part of Pete and anybody who kind of loves getting those competitive juices flowing. And while getting to see guys like Geno Smith and Colby Parkinson and Penny Hard play big big snaps in the Seahawks game is fun. I'm sure there are people who would prefer maybe some closer games, but against the Jets, a must-win game, a team that's 0-12 going into this game, who seemed to be actively attempting to lose. For anybody who watched their game against the Raiders the week previously, they had a chance to win. It's like they kind of lucked their way into a potential win and then threw it away by playing engage 8 defense on the final play of the game and leaving Derek Carr to throw a pass to Henry Ruggs for a touchdown and giving the Raiders a win. So the Jets aren't trying to win. The Seahawks are trying to win. It was predictable that this is kind of how it would go. Russ looked like Russ. I think that's kind of the biggest takeaway. And sure, there are definitely some elements of it that were potentially because it was the Jets and their secondary is bad and their linebackers are bad and their defensive line is bad and their offense is bad. And I could keep going and going, but they're just not a good team. But it's still, the Seahawks lost to the Giants, who are also not a very good team. They're a better defensive team, certainly. But I think we saw Russ, you completed 21 passes on 27 attempts, 206 yards, 4 touchdowns. He did throw the 1 interception, which was his 12th interception of the season, which is a career high for Russ. Certainly not great. He had a game a couple years ago where he threw 5 interceptions in a game. And so for him to now have thrown 12 this season, clearly just an indication that he's been struggling. But the interception he threw in this game, for those of you who watched, was so not his fault, really. Like the complaint in the Giants game for Russ specifically was that he wasn't giving DK Metcalf a chance to win those one-on-one balls. This was a complaint for the Seahawks also against the Rams. They specifically against Jalen Ramsey, who's obviously very, very talented and is one of the few defensive backs in the league that I think could very capably shut down DK Metcalf. But Russ didn't even give him a shot. Russ almost never threw that way. And it just was a situation where, you take your best receiver out of the game because you're not even giving him a chance. And then we didn't see him do that much in the Giants game either. And it was kind of this frustration. And then in this game, early in the game, Russ throws a 50-50 ball to DK Metcalf. He was, running for his life. He kind of had to contort his body a little bit to get the throw off. And it wasn't a great throw from Russ. Don't get me wrong. He underthrew DK. DK had to turn and try to come back to the ball. And then Marcus May, the cornerback for the Jets, made an incredible leaping play, tipped the ball to himself, caught it in the end zone. Fantastic play from Marcus May. I think that's the biggest takeaway from that interception, is that it was just a super nice play. And frankly, it's proof that they're called 50-50 balls for a reason. DK is not going to win every single one of them. He just didn't win this one. And again, it's not his fault. I don't think at all. It's more Russ's fault than anything. But I'm glad that we saw Russ do that, not throw an interception. Obviously, I'm not glad about that, but I'm glad that he gave that a shot, that he attempted to throw that 50-50 ball, because that's what we hadn't seen from him in the last few weeks. We'd seen this very, very like not confident Russell Wilson. And I think that is what we wanted to see him do more of. So I'm glad that he was able to do that. And I'm still kind of hoping to see more from Russ. I think that this game was good, but it doesn't wipe out his last couple of games. There's still some issues to go. I think that this is probably more of a product of the Jets than anything, but I'm still happy to see him get his confidence back. I'm hoping that means that we'll see him look a lot better going forward. Obviously, they have the Washington football team next week. Then they have the Rams and the 49ers. So he doesn't have a lot of opportunities. This was his kind of gimme game. Washington's great defensively. The Rams obviously had their way with them. And San Francisco, not a great team, but they're a good defensive team. And so I think that there's some concern that these next few games are going to be pretty tough for Russell Wilson. All right. The other thing that I wanted to talk about really quickly before we're having some technical issues. Hopefully Maura will be able to join here in just a second. But until she does, the Seahawks running game was a huge thing in this game as well. Chris Carson and Carlos Hyde combined for 27 carries. They had 142 total yards on the ground. Carson obviously scored that touchdown. And Maura's here. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to bring her on here. Hi, Maura.
Hi, I'm so sorry I'm late. The way I have this laid out, I wasn't seeing the bottom screen. I apologize.
Not a problem at all. StreamYard is kind of strange, and this is not the first time that guests have had issues with it, so no worries at all. Well, I guess I'll give my intro now a little bit later. Super excited to be joined by Maura Dooley today. Maura produces the Wyman and Bob Show on 710 ESPN. You can find her on Twitter at Maura_Dool. For many things, including free fantasy football advice, which may be needed for some of you during this time of year. Welcome. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to see you.
Yeah, you too. So that's kind of the one of the things I want to talk about first. It's never the happiest topic, but I'm just kind of curious about it. I know a lot of people are curious about it too, is just kind of working in sports media from March until now, and how you still are alive and haven't ripped your hair out and any of that. And I know in particular, 710 has obviously taken a lot of hits, and it's been a tough place. So I'm just kind of curious how you've been kind of coping with that, and, doing a lot more work from home, I imagine, and kind of how that's been for you.
Yeah. We were working from home. My show was working from home pretty much from March until I only got back in studio, I think, early October.
Mm-hmm.
And that definitely had its challenges getting.
Yeah, I imagine.
To 710 ESPN's credit, they decided that was the safest thing to do and turn things around pretty quickly. But, when you try to make such a big change so quickly, there was definitely some technical difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
The listeners bared with us, which was really nice, when we definitely had some shows at the beginning where we're a little messy, and we had a lot of thanking us for still being on air when everything was so crazy. So we appreciated that. And I honestly thought it was going to be more challenging to cover those months without really sports going on.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we lucked out with some things like the Last Dance documentary.
Yeah.
We probably talked Jadeveon Clowney to death. I think our listeners got to see that. We talked about him every day for months.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But there were things to talk about, so it wasn't quite as challenging as I thought it would be. We did a lot of lists, a lot of hot topic debates.
Yeah, I think that stuff's kind of fun, and it's kind of fun to flex some creative muscles a little bit instead of just talking about the things that are dominating all of the news headlines, to have to kind of dig a little deeper. It's a morbid reason to have to do that, but I'm sure that there was kind of some fun in trying to find different things to talk about. Hopefully things other than Jadeveon Clowney.
You're breaking up on me. I'm going to see maybe if I plug in some headphones.
Oh, there you go. Oh, no problem. Let's see.
Okay, I'm sorry. Do you want to ask again?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's kind of fun to try to flex creative muscles a little bit, when you're trying to find content to write about. I know it's a rather morbid reason to have to do that, but at least kind of maybe that was a little bit fun.
Yeah, and I think it allowed a lot of athletes and coaches some time, some free time they wouldn't normally have.
Yeah.
So, like Pete Carroll did that podcast with Steve Kerr, the Flying Coach
Right.
podcast. And so I feel like you got to hear from them in a way that you wouldn't normally, especially with everything going on with, social justice issues on top of the pandemic. And I thought it was actually, I don't know, kind of a special time without sports to get to know those guys better.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were talking a little bit on the Seahawks-Jets game, which I was kind of saying that it must be nice for Seahawks fans, and I know for Seahawks media, to not have to change the lead like 6 times in the last 5 minutes of the game. Like you didn't even have to watch the fourth quarter to write the end of this one. So the main thing I wanted to talk about was just Russell Wilson. He's obviously been the topic of conversation surrounding this team really for years, but specifically for the last couple of weeks with his play has kind of taken a pretty precipitous dip from what it looked like at the beginning of the year. He was obviously back in this one, phenomenal game, 4 touchdowns, completed almost all of his passes. Did have the 1 interception, but I was saying right before you came on that was more just a really nice play from Marcus May than it was a bad throw from Russ.
Yeah.
Do you attribute this game from Russ more to him actually turning things around, or was it more of a Jets thing? Because I think a lot of things are kind of just Jets things in some situations.
Yeah, it's hard to watch that game and not think like, wow, this team might actually be worse than I think most people thought before the game, which we all didn't really have much respect for them going into it.
Right.
But I think that you can still take some things away from the fact that the offense had seemed to kind of lose its identity the last month or so. They started off so hot and it was really fun to watch. And I think that's, in an ideal world, what fans would like to see Russell Wilson do. Right. But it's not necessarily sustainable. Right. I know Pete Carroll talked last week about how this season got off to a hot start for a lot of offenses. Holding calls were down. And I think that they're starting to call more of those and defenses are catching up. And it just might not be sustainable. So I think what you can take away from the Jets game is that they really seem to be balanced. They seem to come out with some innovative plays, using David Moore on the end arounds and just getting everyone involved, Freddie Swain and Penny Hard and Disley getting a touchdown. Yep. So yeah, it's the Jets, but I think, getting so close to the playoffs, it was encouraging just to see the offense look that balanced and it looks like something that they can repeat.
Yeah, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but I think too, Chris Carson and Carlos Hyde had 27 combined carries for 142 yards and a touchdown from Carson. Like, we talked so much about letting Russ cook and this whole big movement with like Seahawks Twitter and more analytics and kind of the more old school coaching styles of Pete Carroll and of Brian Schottenheimer, and how the start the year you saw them really kind of lean into that. Like Russ was throwing the ball left and right, and the running game was a factor, but not nearly to the levels it had been in the last 10 years or so. And then it fell apart, obviously, for a couple of weeks. And I think part of that was the injuries to the running backs. With them not there, teams could really game plan for constant passing and a lot of different things happened there. Obviously, when the Rams figured out to just completely lock down DK Metcalf, and there seemed to be no follow-up plan from the Seahawks to beat that. But I wanted to talk about how I think, you look at this game, it's one of Russ's most efficient games of the year, but he threw for 260 yards. Like, that's a lot less, like half what he was throwing for in some other games. So I think I'm just curious your take on how important these running backs are to this offense and how critical their performance was on Sunday.
I mean, I think it's very important because I think that at the end of the day, that is what Pete Carroll wants. And that is how this team is built. So I do think that the offensive line has done a really good job this year because we've seen some bad offensive lines here. Yes. But I think this offensive line is not built to pass block as much as they were. And so I just think that because I know we had a texter complaining today that the guys on the show were kind of saying that Russell Wilson is better when he doesn't have to pass as much, that there's like a sweet spot where, if he's throwing for 300 yards is too much. And they were saying that was bull and he could do that in another offense. And I mean, I guess I tend to agree with them. Maybe in the Chiefs offense, he
Sure.
could do that, but I don't think that that's ever going to happen here. And I do think the running backs are important to what they do. And I mean, Chris Carson, he gets hurt a lot. And so I think maybe he doesn't get the credit he deserves, but he's he's phenomenal.
Yeah. I think it's hard to argue that he's not, from a talent perspective, like top 8, top 6, maybe running back in the league. I mean, just in terms of, I don't watch every game, obviously, but there are not a lot of running backs I can think of that are demonstrably better at him with a football in their hands. And he just, misses a handful of games every year at least. And that kind of hurts him a little bit, but yeah, I agree 100%.
It hasn't helped that Carlos Hyde has proven to be quite injury prone this year too, because he was the insurance.
It's like that's what happened last year. Like the Seahawks, all of the running backs got hurt last year, so of course all of the running backs got hurt this year. And Rashad Penny still hasn't come back. Maybe that's coming soon, hopefully. But I mean, I don't know. I guess I can ask that question next. Is I don't expect anything from him this year just because of how much time he's missed. Do you think that there's any chance he's going to be on the field or contributing much?
I mean, maybe they try to get him out there to knock some of the rust off. But yeah, I get the impression that they're not sure if they're going to hang on to Carson next year. And I think they feel like Penny's an investment that, they keep saying all since last year at the end of the year that they didn't want to rush him. And so, I don't think we're going to see him get meaningful playing time, but I mean, cause we're kind of running out here and you'd think they'd have to ease him in. I mean, maybe if he gets a little in the last game or so, maybe you play him in the playoffs. I'm kind of with you on there. It's a tough one. And I am really curious if their plan of not keeping Carson, which plan isn't the right word. I don't know their specifics, but having the option to not bring Carson back, if that seems like less of an option now that haven't had Penny for so long, like it's so risky to count on him. I honestly wouldn't want to be in their shoes making the decision with Carson next year because we said, he's so talented, but then you have to weigh the games he misses and he doesn't want to take a discount. You've already seen him take notice of other running backs getting contracts and stuff. So I don't think he's going to be looking to take less.
Well, if I'm an NFL running back, for sure, I'm getting as much guaranteed money as I possibly can because especially for him, he's had so many injuries and running back shelf life is already so short. And, but the problem is if I'm the Seahawks on the same token, I'm like, I don't want to give you guaranteed money because you've missed games every single year of your career. So it's going to be a messy one. I'm curious how that will shake out. But I think the argument that like Carlos Hyde obviously has been injury prone too, but the fact that he played so well is almost an argument against Carson in a way too of like, is it just that the Seahawks offensive line can create holes? Like Hyde was good last year. Like he's a good running back, but it's like, if they can find a guy like that for whatever they're paying him, $6 million or $4 million or whatever, like, are they gonna, I don't know. It's an interesting situation with running backs and contracts in general. It'll be interesting to see what they do there.
Definitely.
So moving on to the receivers, I know you touched on your fantasy football show that you did before last week's games. You touched on DK and Lockett being guys to potentially pick up because basically Jets, which was smart. Both of them had great games. But what we've seen from the Seahawks, and we'll get into more fantasy football stuff later, but Russell Wilson really likes to spread the love. He likes to throw the ball to a lot of different guys, and that was a little bit different in this game. And obviously part of that was because they could. And I mean, in the end of the game, some of the receptions by some of these guys were from Geno Smith. They weren't even from Russ, obviously. But I'm curious, just from obviously as somebody who does do fantasy football analyst or analysis, and just seeing this game, like how important it is to have both those guys and even the rest of the receiver core kind of playing at their peak for this team to really do some damage going forward.
Oh, I mean, I think it's huge because you have one of the best quarterbacks in the league, and I think one of the best receiver duos in the league. Yeah. It's kind of hard to tell because they did have this last month where they were kind of struggling to find an identity. But before that, man, Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf were just unstoppable. And then it got to the point where it seemed like teams would shut down one or the other. I think they can get back to a point where it's both of them are reeling in
huge passes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and then David Moore has had a really surprising year, I think. He's always been a guy that, comes up with a big play every now and then, but he's consistently been a big part of the offense this year. And I know we had some texters that have been mad that he's had a couple of drops, but so is DK, it happens.
Yep.
And then, it's even like we said earlier, Freddie Swain and Penny Hart have stepped in a little. I'm interested to see what Josh Gordon might be able to do when he gets in there. But then that kind of takes away from your wanting to have the balanced run game if you're doing 3 receiver sets all the time.
Right.
So
I'm curious about that too. You make a great point about Moore, because I think his last couple seasons, he's had like 3 or 4 game stretches that were really good and then was just vanished for months at a time. And this year he's definitely had like, better games than others, but for the most part, he has been consistent. And you talk about the end around plays, which have helped him statistically, obviously do a little bit better, but also just strain the defenses because they don't really expect that play to happen. I'm insanely curious what happens with Josh Gordon too, because he was such a kind of possession receiver when they had him last year. Like, I think all of his catches were first downs and like only one of them was more than like 15 yards. He basically just had a bunch of like 10-yard quick gains, which is not a receiver like kind of archetype that they have right now. They don't have that guy.
No.
Like, DK is a deep guy. Lockett is a deep guy, and he can kind of be that guy, but they haven't used him like that. Moore's not that. So I think Gordon could be like, Gordon's going to replace the tight end production that we just haven't seen all year. There has not been tight end production. And I don't think that's a product. Like, Will Dissly's not just bad now. I think he's still good. I just think they're not using him. And I don't really know why. I don't know if you have any insight into why that is, but it's been
I'm baffled because of how much they invested.
Yeah.
In that. Like, it seemed. Yeah, we were talking to, John Clayton on our show, and he's like, before the season, he's like, oh, yeah, they're going to do all kinds of 2 tight end sets, because why wouldn't they with Dissly and Olsen? And, they gave Dissly a lot of money. They, I mean, Hollister, when they tendered him, I think he's what, $3 million this year? He's making a good amount of money too. So it's confusing to me why they haven't gotten the tight ends more involved. But, obviously then Olsen got hurt.
Right.
So, yeah, you're right. Maybe Gordon could bring a little bit of that. And, he was here for such a short time last year, but had some big plays. And you got to love that he's a guy that's not going to get mad if he doesn't get enough targets. He's going to go out there and help. And, never been a problem to anyone else. Unfortunately, he just has his own issues. So I think he can only help.
Yeah, absolutely. He seems to have a good attitude about it. And I am curious though, because like we kind of talked ourselves into maybe he'll replace that production, but there just hasn't been a lot of it. So it's like, is he going to get touches? Like, and if he gets a handful of targets a game, does that mean that Will Dissly gets 0? Like, literally, I'm very curious how that's going to shake out.
Yeah. Are you wondering because you have Dissly as your fantasy tight end?
I am partly wondering because I have Dissly as my fantasy tight end. I mean, who didn't pick him up after Greg Olsen went down? It seemed like such an obvious choice, but yeah, it has not shaken out well so far. I feel like any game he's going to get like a 65-yard touchdown because that happens a few times a year for him, but I just don't know when the heck it's going to happen.
Well, he did get in last game.
Yeah, that's
just
true. He did score.
One.
Yeah, he did score last game, so maybe that'll be the case. Okay, so switching to the defense, and specifically when talking about this defense, you kind of have to talk about Jamal Adams, who broke the record for most sacks by a defensive back in a single season, and he did it in eight, nine games, something like that.
9 games, I think. Yeah.
9 games, which is just absolutely ridiculous. And it's, I mean,
everything that we wanted from Jadeveon Clowney.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And it's been fascinating to me to watch Pete Carroll do something different on defense, because at his baseline, he doesn't do things different on defense. Like, that's not something that they've done for a long time. They haven't adjusted much. And I think part of the reason he hired Ken Norton was because he knew that he wouldn't do things differently than how Pete wanted to do them. And there's been some problems with that. And certainly last year, the decision to continually stay in base defense when the linebackers were not good in coverage, and then this year to draft a line. There's a lot of things that have been a challenge, and this defense certainly hasn't been good for the vast majority of the year, although they have been better lately. But watching them utilize Jamal Adams in a way that they've never utilized a defensive back before ever, even when they had a guy like Cam Chancellor, who I think probably would have been really good at this. I think he might have been extraordinary at this. He was better in coverage than Adams, but I'm just curious if you have any like insight into like why they're using him this way, or if it's just one of those things that has just kind of been born out of circumstance. They needed to get more pass rush and figured out that he was really good at it.
Yeah, I think it might be more that. I feel like when they first got him, I was a little worried because I think there's a history with getting guys that are really fun to watch and really good, but you don't exactly know how to use them, like Percy Harvin and Jimmy Graham and even maybe Jadeveon Clowney. I don't know if that was the issue. It was mostly his injury, but it didn't work out exactly the way they thought, you know?
No.
So I was like, oh no, is this going to be another one where he's super talented, but he doesn't really fit into what they do? Because like you said, they don't blitz a lot, and he apparently, you know, that's a huge strength for him. So, but I think, and then I kind of wonder if that's what some of the struggle was early on, because I think Pete Carroll built this defense this offseason. Everybody was wondering why they didn't go after a pass rusher, but I think he built it with the secondary being the strength, bringing in Dunbar, and we already saw what Diggs could do last year. And, you know, having Griffin on the other side, bringing in Adams and spending so big on him. And then just, you know, everything with Dunbar didn't work out. And then you've got Griffin hurt at a certain point too. And Adams is great, but he's, people say he's bad in coverage. I don't think he's bad in coverage, but I just think if you're blitzing him all the time, then he's not even, you know, it's just not the same as the safeties that we've seen in this Pete Carroll secondary. So I think that maybe there was a little bit of a struggle to find a balance between what they normally do and evolve. So I'm not sure if that took some coaxing on Ken Norton's part or what. You know, they say it was this accountability meeting that got everything straightened out. I'm sure there was also some issues with so many new guys and all the injuries, just getting everyone up to speed. But it is impressive that like they've changed their philosophy this much. I do know that we on Wyman and Bob, we interviewed Jaron Reed, and we also talked to Cliff Averill, and they both said that like for defensive line pride, they don't want a defensive back leading the team in sacks. Like you can't have that. So I don't know. The pass rushers are going to have to step up if they want to. I don't think they're going to take that title from him.
I don't think so either. Yeah, it's frustrating because like obviously the moves they made to try to shore up the pass rush, there were very few, and the ones that they did make, obviously we haven't seen Darrell Taylor at all because he was injured, and he was a guy that they were hoping would be a part of that. We were hoping from a step up from LJ Collier, and he's better, but he's still not a great pass rusher. Rasheem Green obviously was the leader last year, and he's been hurt. The Carlos Dunlap acquisition was phenomenal. And I've mentioned this a few times on this show, but my first episode was the Monday after the Bills game. And so when I was taking notes for my first episode, at that time, the Seahawks, I think, had one loss. And my title was, are the Seahawks Super Bowl contenders with Carlos Dunlap? And then the Bills game happened, and then the Rams game happened, and then the Giants game happened. I was like, oh my God, I jinxed them. Like, this is all my fault. But now they kind of look like they're back on track. And I think Dunlap is helpful when he's healthy. He just hasn't been able to stay healthy. And I'm not surprised that the Seahawks I'm surprised because they don't usually blitz secondary, but I'm not surprised it's not a defensive lineman because they just didn't do enough to shore up that area. And one frustration that I've had throughout the season that I finally can breathe a little bit easier about is the lack of usage of Shaquem Griffin off the edge. And we finally got to see that against the Jets, and he did well. He got a sack, like he looked good. And I know that, from, my time on the beat and talking to staff and everybody, I understand that his size is definitely a concern there. And I get it. He's small, but like somebody pointed out, what was Mekhi Becton going to try to do to stop Shaquem Griffin, like with his ears pinned back coming at him? Like, he's just not fast enough. Shaquem can get around people like that. So I don't know what your thoughts are about hoping to see, but I would love to see more of him in a pass rushing role for the next couple of weeks. What else have they got to lose, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely would. Dave Wyman was just talking about this on our show about how fast he is. It's insane.
Yeah.
And I just think I've been hoping for a long time they could find a way to get him in there more. At the beginning of the season, when they were using him to spy a little bit, because he's so fast, I think they did it in the Cowboys game. It seemed like he might have had some success, but then they tried it with Kyler Murray, and that didn't go so well. So,
right.
I know you obviously they like him and they see his talents, but it just seems like they haven't been able to find, a more consistent role for him.
Yeah, I kind of thought he would be like Jacob. I cannot think of his last name. The guy that they traded for Jadeveon Clowney.
Martin.
Thank you, Jacob Martin. Obviously, Martin is probably about 20 to 30 pounds heavier than Shaquem. There's a big difference, but like that was Martin's role, was basically just like a Hellraiser off the edge. And it seems like they could utilize Shaquem more, but obviously they're tentative to do it for more than a handful of snaps per game. Maybe they just think that's the most efficient way to do it. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe that's it. I know, Jacob Martin, I thought I heard that when they, at the trade deadline, when they were looking into people, they actually looked into bringing him back, but
I heard that
didn't
too.
Work out.
Yeah, no, that would have been fun. He was great. He was a really good find in the 6th round for them, and it was a bummer to give him up. But obviously, the trade still made a lot of sense for the Seahawks to do, even if Clowney didn't pan out the way that they would have hoped. I think that I would trade Martin and Barkevious Mingo for Jadeveon Clowney pretty much every year that I could. But yeah,
I think most Seahawks fans would do it just for the Niners game last year.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that was so much fun. All right. So moving on, the Seahawks, they're done with the Jets. Unfortunately, the Jets' next game is against the Rams, which is does not help the Seahawks. I think the fact that we have to now root for the Jets to win is problematic because I don't think that they're trying to win. So I don't think that that's going to happen there. But the Seahawks turn their attention to Washington. The next 3 games, they got Washington, they got the Rams, and then they got the 49ers. And obviously the only team that's better than the Seahawks, or at least certainly better than the Seahawks, is the Rams. Washington and San Francisco have really, really good defenses, and they have really good pass rushes. And I have a feeling that it's going to be, that Jets game was a nice break, but it's going to be a grind for these next 3 games for Russell Wilson and that offensive line.
I completely agree with you. I was looking at the schedules last week because there was a point a few weeks ago where I feel like everyone was saying the Seahawks have the easiest schedule down the stretch and the Rams have it harder. And I think within the last few weeks, the way things have developed, it looks like the Rams have the easier schedule, especially with how the Giants showed up against the Seahawks. And but yeah, it's because I think the Rams get the Cardinals one more time too, and they're not playing too well right now.
Right.
But yeah, I think the Washington football team's defense is for real. Their offense isn't really scary right now, especially if Dwayne Haskins is back in. He wasn't able to get much going when Alex Smith left, but man, Chase Young is the real deal. And it's really their front. And I feel like so far this season, when the Seahawks have faced really good defensive fronts like that, like the Eagles, it's been rough.
Yeah.
But maybe they're a little more balanced now, and that will help on offense.
Yeah, I think they'll be a little bit more ready for it, but I have to bring this up because I think this is so funny. So the Washington football team beat the 49ers last week 23-15, and they scored 23 points on 3 field goals, a fumble recovery for a touchdown, and a pick 6. So their offense scored 0 touchdowns. And the 23 points is not a lot, and obviously the problem was that for San Francisco was that they only scored 15. But that's scary to me. I think the Seahawks will probably luck their way into more than 15 points, even against a good defense. They're still going to find ways to score. But man, that Chase Young is so good, and the rest of their front line is so good. And Russ has been turnover prone this year, and the offensive line is built to run protect, not built to pass protect. And it's and even for the Seahawks, I think had they not lost to the Giants, this game has screamed trap game to me. Like they would have been coming off a handful of wins in a row. They'd be so focused on the Rams. Now I think maybe they're going to be less. It's going to be less of a game that they accidentally overlook because Washington has looked pretty good lately. They're technically ahead of them in the playoff picture right now because of the way the seeding works. So I'm hoping that they'll really be ready to go for this one. But this game makes me nervous. I'm not going to lie.
No, it makes me nervous too. We've been talking about that a lot of the shows on the station. I don't think it's just you at all. It's definitely that's a defense to be feared, and you just have to hope, like we said, that the offense really fixed some issues last week, and it wasn't just the Jets, because I don't know. Well, and then the defense has been getting better the last few weeks. You can hope that they can score some defensive points to help you out on that end. But it's I'm scared for that game also. I think that's going to be a tough one. And I've been playing in my fantasy playoff. I played a gentleman that has the Washington football defense, and they scored him 27 points yesterday.
Oh no. I guess the pick six and a fumble touchdown would do it. My goodness. That's insane. Yeah. To be fair, that was a great play to play Washington against San Francisco. That's a no-brainer. That was smart. All right, one more question before we go to a quick break. And we kind of touched on this already, so we're probably going to be repeating things. But if the Seahawks are going to for the Seahawks to win the next 3 games, they need to blank. Like, how do the Seahawks go 12-4 this season? Like, what needs to happen for that to be the case?
That's a good one. I would say, I think that the defense has been playing well, but I think they're going to need to start getting some interceptions or fumbles in those games for sure. I mean, that's always a pretty obvious one, but against the level of teams they're playing, I think they're going to have to help the offense out, because there's some tough defensive matchups on the horizon. And then on the flip side, Russ is at 12 interceptions now, I think. Yep. He's going to have to protect the ball, and I think even if they're playing leased out defenses, they're going to have to establish the run. Yeah. I would say between, Carson and Hyde, they need to get at least 60 yards a game. Yep. We'll see. Yeah, I mean, those are all fairly obvious, but.
No, I think it's good. I mean, that's kind of what I was going to say for the first one is I think the defense needs to force turnovers. I think that absolutely needs to happen in all of these games. They need to force at least a handful. A pick six would be great, or a fumble recovery touchdown. They haven't had very many of those this year. And I think that this is a really nice time to finally, Jamal Adams had one bounce off his chest last week. KJ and Poona Ford fought over one that they should have caught last week. Like, maybe that'll come around and they'll actually get the ball in their hands this week or the next couple of weeks, because I think they really, really need it.
Yeah, that can only happen against the Jets. You cannot miss those opportunities these next few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, we're going to take a quick break, but then when we come back, we're going to talk about the XFL, which I haven't had a chance to talk about on this show yet, and then we'll talk even more fantasy football in just about 5 minutes.
It's the Worldwide Sports Radio Network. You're listening to the Pacific Northwest Sports Radio Show on the Worldwide Sports Radio Network.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Still here with Maura Dooley, going to switch gears to talk about the other football team, professional football team, at least in the city of Seattle, the XFL Seattle Dragons. Unfortunately, as most of us were focused on our own, health and safety, and the cancellation of the NBA season and the cancellation of the NCAA tournament back in March, the XFL also had their season cut short, and unfortunately, they were not able to come back for that season and will not be back in 2021. There was a lot of messiness that I won't get into all of right now, but they do still exist. They were purchased by a company Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and other people. I know that there was more to it than that, but they're planning to come back in 2022. And Mar, you had an opportunity, as well as myself and a handful of other people, to attend games and attend practices this season and kind of see that season come together with summer camp and everything that was going on. And then you obviously had the opportunity to be the sideline reporter for the home games, or for all the games, or for at least the home games.
I traveled with them to the first few, and then there was one they traveled to where they were starting to worry about COVID, and before everything got shut down, I didn't get to go to.
So I kind of just wanted to ask, I was going to say, I just wanted to ask about what
Sorry,
that
go
experience was like for you, and obviously like a really cool role, a cool opportunity, a new league, and just kind of what that was like being around that team in their first year. Hopefully not only year.
I know. Yeah, I hope we're back. It was awesome. I really enjoyed. Sorry, my dog is right next to me here.
Right.
I really enjoyed being around all the. I feel like so many of the players that don't make it to the NFL don't really have anywhere else to showcase themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They can go play in Canada, but there's nothing here. We really should have a spring league that gives them a better shot at that. And so many of these guys were super talented and maybe just had like an injury right before the draft, or just weird things that didn't go their way. And so many of them also played in the AAF that it breaks my heart how many times these things have gone awry for them when they think that they found a place. But yeah, it was really fun. And I also thought that the fans were really into it here.
Seemed like it
was really popular. Sorry, my dog is trying to join the show.
Okay, my dog is locked out of here, which is helpful.
I should have done that.
No, it's all good.
But yeah, it's heartbreaking that it had to end sooner than it was supposed to, because I think they had a really good plan and it was going really well.
Well, what was frustrating to me is that, like, we've seen so many of these leagues fail, and obviously, the initial iteration of the XFL failed, 20 years ago, and there have been attempts prior to that. There was attempts after that. There was the AAF last year, and most of them failed because of issues with how they set up the league. They didn't account for certain things. They didn't have the financial backing necessarily, or they didn't seem to get the fan interest. And with the XFL, this iteration of the XFL, they failed because of a pandemic. Like, they failed because of something that was like highly unprecedented or unpredictable. Obviously, we saw some things shake out after that maybe painted the picture of a league that wouldn't have been super sustainable anyway, because they were having some issues at the top. But what they did not fail because of a lack of fan engagement. That did not seem to be certainly wasn't a problem in Seattle. It didn't seem like it was a problem in other places. And you kind of touched on that already, but assuming we're back in 2022, assuming we're back in Seattle, which, as far as I know, we don't know if that's the case. Is that correct? Have they specified where the teams are going to be, or if they're going to be in the same spot?
I don't believe so.
Yeah.
I think that maybe LA is that for sure. It might have been Wonder One, but from everything I hear, they're trying to keep the same teams and a lot of the same staff intact if they can.
Yeah, why not? I mean, that makes sense. It's not like it's a 20-year break. It's a 2-year break. So the last thing I was just going to say on that real quick was, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, sorry. I appreciate that Danny Garcia, it's The Rock's ex-wife that he does a lot of his business deals with. They're partners in this. So she's the first owner of a major sports league. But yeah, she said that they would like to try to rehire as many people as they can. But, it's kind of a weird situation where so many other people by that long after are probably going to have other gigs by that point. So we'll see. But I hope that they come back out here. I think that the fan base is definitely there. Them and St. Louis. St. Louis was the other really crazy for the XFL city.
So I wanted to ask you about just the experience of being the reporter on the sideline. And obviously, like, one of the big things that the XFL did so differently was far more player engagement with media during the games and coach engagement with media during the games. It was kind of one of the many innovative things that they were attempting to do, in addition to a handful of rule changes, which we'll kind of get to. But what was that experience like for you, just kind of being down there and being more involved in gameplay than most media members get to be in other sports?
I thought it was really cool. And as a fan, when I watched the other XFL broadcast, I thought it was a really cool aspect of it. Although I did sometimes feel bad when, like, a field goal kicker missed a kick and they immediately stuck a mic in his face. I was kind of glad that I didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
I worked for the team, so I wasn't really trying to get like the that kind of hot take or, just interview like that. But it was really cool just to get, a lot of people had been hoping to see BJ Daniels go in because he had played for the Seahawks, and people here locally knew him a little better than Brandon Silvers. And, Silvers had struggled a little. So when he finally did go in and lead them on a scoring drive that was in St. Louis, I was able to go over to him right away and ask him about it, and then, post that to Twitter. And it's just a really cool way to engage with your fans when you're not necessarily, for the first year, they couldn't do a radio broadcast. They wanted to see how it went and see if they could branch out into that. But I felt like they were really innovative in finding different ways to connect with their fans.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's so frustrating to see it kind of go a little bit backwards. Like ideally they'll kind of keep going with some of this stuff in 2022 when they come back. But I thought that they were like right on the edge of like, they did a lot of cool stuff. And I think if they fine tune some things, like maybe not interviewing those kickers right after missed field goals, that was probably ill advised. But if they fine tune a few things like that, I think that this could be what football needs, what American football needs. Is you touched on it earlier, seeing guys like Keenan Reynolds, who was so close to making the Seahawks roster. Like they had so many talented receivers, and I watched him like for 2 years, and I'm like, this dude is good enough to be in the NFL, and he just didn't quite make it. And then he got a chance in the XFL. I don't know if you saw on Twitter today, he apparently is going to Johns Hopkins now, which is a different change for him. So that's very cool. But I don't know what he's going to study there, but I saw that he's like, got accepted at Johns Hopkins. I'm like, oh, that's cool. But anyway, but yeah, it's something that's much needed is having, these guys shouldn't have to go to Canada to play football. They shouldn't have to, there's, like in basketball, there's obviously the G League, and there's also like tons of European leagues. In baseball, there's like, 4 minor league teams per organization. So there's tons of options for them. So it's nice to hopefully have more spring football. And I think the XFL was doing some really cool things. And we kind of already touched on the sideline reporting and that kind of media side. But I was curious about some of the rule changes. Like I thought some of it was really, really fun. I thought the kickoff, it may have been less fun, but it was probably smarter and safer. And then the 3-2-3 1-point conversions was super cool. I was just curious your thoughts on some of that rule stuff that we saw from the XFL.
Yeah, no, I thought that stuff was fun too. It was interesting to see how if you do change it to where you get 3-2 or 1 point and you try from the 10 instead, and it didn't work out as often as I thought it would, because there was a lot of coaches that were like, I'm just going to try to go for 2 every time, or 3 every, and well, I guess there weren't a lot, but there was a few of them, and it was harder to do than you would think. Yeah. I honestly, if I had my choice, I would put them in charge of the NFL officiating. I thought they did a much better job of putting that together.
Yes, I agree.
Everybody really liked the transparency of the being able to see what was going on in the booth and walk through. Sometimes they were changing their mind, and they were very quick about it when they sent something up to the booth for review. Something cool also that they did with the officiating was that they made sure they had a female official on every crew, which I thought was really cool as well.
Yeah. I loved a lot of what the XFL did. I loved the transparency and kind of just the openness with fans. We kind of touched on that, but you're right. I had forgotten about the referees and kind of the officiating and how they did that too, which was also really cool. I just think that there was so many innovative things, and they had so much time to really come up with like creative ways to not dramatically alter football, but make it like a really engaging product for fans. And I thought they nailed it in 1 year. And it's so unfortunate that they kind of have to back up a little bit, but there's some tweaks to iron out and stuff. And maybe a year off will help them fix some of that stuff. I don't know, but I really hope they're back in 2022. And I hope we get chances to go to games, because I think that'd be super fun.
I hope so too. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't pick back up with the cities, especially like if they were going to lose some cities. I don't think this one would be one of them because they did so well.
You think Jim Zorn would come back?
Too. I don't know. I think he really enjoyed coaching the guys, and it seemed like they liked him. I felt bad for him because I'm not sure it was really well known publicly, but their offensive coordinator had some family issues and had to leave the team right before the season started. And so Zorn wasn't supposed to be the play caller. and he had to step in and do that. And, once a team already knows certain terminology and set of plays and everything, and you have to kind of try to bring in your own at the last minute. It wasn't that long before the season started. I felt like they were just hitting a groove and like getting to where they needed to be. And then everything got shut down. And I was really excited for their second half of the season there. And that was a bummer.
Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed, like you said, that they'll be back and that they'll hopefully be another great option for. And that was another thing too. I'm gonna bring up one more thing. The XFL really kind of prioritized trying to make it so that you could afford to like take a family of 4 to a game, which is obviously something that is really difficult to do at Seahawks games and at a lot of other sporting events. Even like Mariners games are very expensive. And I thought that was a cool thing to try to really like allow, like I'm a family of 4 and I can't spend $1,000 to go to a Seahawks game, but I can spend, a couple hundred or less to go to a XFL game. And I thought that was a cool thing that they tried to do too.
Yeah. And I saw that a lot at work when I was at 710 on the text line when we talked about it. A lot of people sent in texts that were like, this is the first time I've been able to bring my whole family to a sporting event because I can't afford it normally, or being able to avoid, a lot of people could actually afford season tickets to the Dragons that wouldn't be able to afford season tickets to, the Seahawks or the Mariners or, and, the fact that it was still at CenturyLink, you're still getting that, game day environment. Even, with what I think their opening day crowd was, I don't want to say the wrong number. I want to say it was maybe like 28,000 or something like that. It still felt really loud there. I don't know if you were out there that day.
I was, yeah. Yeah, that was a really fun game. Obviously, all of their games were fun, but that home opener was a blast. I had so much fun at that game.
Yeah.
All right. Last thing, just fantasy football. I just was hoping to give you a chance to kind of talk about what you do with fantasy football. I recognize the background because I know that that's where you stand when you post your fantasy football videos. I've used them. I'm in five fantasy football leagues. I will pretend that I only used your advice for 2 of them because the other 3 I'm doing terrible in. But 2 of them I'm still alive. I'm still kicking. So we're doing good there. But obviously I think the main thing is just you've touched on fantasy football for a while now. And this had to be just the worst year to try to give fantasy football advice, right? Like with just so much chaos in the schedule.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been actually kind of pushing to be able to do something fantasy football related at work. And they're like not so sure that they want it, during a show because not everybody is interested in that. Sure. But I finally talked them into letting me do the videos. And then, it has been an interesting year, but it's been really fun. And I'm glad that people have found them somewhat useful because I'm just kind of a nerd that enjoys it. So it's been fun for me. I had a week where I had Deontay Johnson from the Steelers defense, Ben Roethlisberger, and Derrick Henry when the Titans-Steelers game got canceled, and I was like, oh no. And then all my buys hit, and it's definitely, it's been a challenge. I had a rough patch there, and I made the playoffs, but I believe I'm currently losing. I needed Mark Andrews to have a big night, and it's not happening.
Not happening for you. Dang. Yeah, I've played fantasy football for a really long time, obviously, and this year has been so brutal with not cancellations. The NFL is very, very quick to remind you that they have not canceled any games, which I think is a weird thing that they're celebrating because there's been so much chaos and games moved for full weeks and stuff. So it's basically like they canceled them, but it's been a really weird year with that. And I've had quarterbacks who just didn't play and I'm like, oh shoot, I don't have a backup, or I have to pick up like Nick Mullins or something, which is just, a nightmare. Yeah. So it's been a rough one. Maura, thank you.
Yeah, it definitely has.
Yeah. I was just going to say thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time and having your dog join us temporarily on the show. I hope we can do this again sometime soon, and I really appreciate it. It's totally fine. I love it. I told you, and I haven't told everybody this story, but I think my second episode, The first segment that I did, my dog chewed through an entire bag of pork rinds while I was talking. So I understand how it goes sometimes. And it's just one of those things. Dogs take those opportunities when they can.
Oh my gosh.
Well, thank you so much again.
And I
really
got home from work a little while ago and I took her on a quick walk, but she was like, just wanting to bring me toys and stuff.
Yep. That's how they are.
Of course. Thank you for having me. This was fun.
All right, so I'm going to take a quick break, and then when I get back, we're going to talk a little bit about the Portland Trail Blazers. They've had 2 preseason games. I don't know how much we should really glean from preseason basketball, but we're going to try. Anyway, we got 25 more minutes, so we're going to sit around and we're going to talk preseason basketball for y'all right after this.
It's the Worldwide Sports Radio Network. You're listening to the Pacific Northwest Sports Radio Show on the Worldwide Sports Radio Network.
All right, welcome back. Going to close the show today talking a little bit Portland Trail Blazers. Their season, like I said at the start of the show, starts in 9 days, December 23rd against the Utah Jazz. It feels like a really, really short offseason because it was a really, really short offseason. I believe LeBron James mentioned this in one of his press conferences that from the last game of the playoffs, so obviously a game the Blazers were not in, but the game that the Lakers were in, until the start of this season is the shortest offseason in the 4 major professional sports ever. So, like, as much as people were kind of upset at LeBron for being somebody who wanted to push the start of the season back till January, and obviously there's weirdness because, yes, it's the shortest offseason ever for the Los Angeles Lakers and the Miami Heat, but there are handfuls of teams who literally have not played since March, which is like the longest offseason ever. So that's just the weird byproduct of having a season that, for most of the teams ended in, a lot of the teams ended in March and a handful of teams ended in the bubble. And then obviously a few teams that continued farther than that. So it's just a weird situation that I don't think there was a perfect answer. I think trying to do as best they can to get back on a normal schedule, which is what they're doing here. 72 game season start in late December gives them a situation where they could conceivably start next year at a normal time in early November, late October, and kind of just go on as if this didn't happen. I think that's likely the NBA's goal, and this is the best way to do it. And sure, it may disadvantage teams like the Lakers and the Heat, but that's fine. They were in a championship last year. It's okay for them to be a little bit disadvantaged. So for Portland, it was a short but hyper productive offseason. They, as you may recall, if you were listening during episode 2, they traded for Robert Covington during my show, and they traded Trevor Ariza and a pair of first-round picks to get him. They signed Derek Jones Jr. They brought back Rodney Hood. They brought back Carmelo Anthony. They signed Enes Kanter. Brought him back too. He counts. They signed Harry Giles. They drafted CJ Ellaby. They had a really, really productive, intense offseason for such a short amount of time. Now they're in a situation where they got 9 days till their first game. They have a lot of new pieces. They have a really deep lineup that I think Terry Stotts can do a lot of different things with. It's going to be really fascinating to watch how this team operates to start the year. And I think, they've played 2 preseason games, both times against the Sacramento Kings. Normally I would take very, very little from preseason games. They don't really matter in any sport. To be perfectly honest, football is perhaps the most kind of egregious example of just, they don't matter. They're just not really particularly relevant. Spring training obviously is a lot longer. It's like 30 days and a bunch of games. So you can glean a little bit from that, but still for the most part, most individual games don't really matter. And for this, just to have a few really quick games is kind of just tune-ups to get guys in game shape before the season actually begins. But with so many new players and a new rotation, I think there is a little bit to get out of it. I put in my notes that trying to glean too much from a game where Keljin Blevins played 24 minutes is a little bit silly. If you kind of furrowed your brow when you heard the name Keljin Blevins, you are not alone. I follow this Blazers team very closely. I listen to podcasts about them. I read news about them. I follow their reporters on Twitter, and I did not know who Keljin Blevins was until very recently. He is the 2-way player that they signed. I was kind of hoping they would bring Jalen Horde back. He was their 2-way guy last year. I thought he showed some promise. If not him, I was kind of hoping they would go for one of the more local undrafted guys. Obviously, Killian Tilly would have been my preference because of my Gonzaga fandom, but even a Trace Tinkle from Oregon State would have been a nice player, Yoeli Childs from BYU. But instead, they went with Keljin Blevins. Blevins played college basketball. He transferred, I believe, from Southern Illinois, and then he played at Montana for a couple of years. He put up okay numbers at Montana. He went undrafted because nobody gets drafted out of the University of Montana. And then he signed a 2-way deal with the Blazers last year, got cut before the season started, played in the G League and averaged 4 points. So why is Keljin Blevins, a guy who did not put up very productive numbers in college, who did not go to a high-profile basketball college, who averaged 4 points as a bench player in the G League, where normally like the top 15 G Leaguers play legitimate NBA minutes, and this dude was a bench player playing 4 minutes or averaging 4 points per game? Well, it's because he's Damian Lillard's cousin. I don't know the specifics here. Maybe the Blazers really do like him. I have a hard time. Nepotism's a real thing in a lot of industries, but I have a hard time imagining that they would give this guy a job on a roster where there's only can roster 15 players because of that. I don't know the specifics. It doesn't really matter. Keljin Blevins is not a particularly impactful piece for this Blazers roster, but I thought it was funny when I was looking up who he was and trying to figure out why they would roster a guy with his numbers in production. And then I saw that little footnote at the end of his Wikipedia page and went, oh, that potentially explains it. But anyway, Keljin Blevins and just about everybody else in the Blazers played about 24 minutes per night in the first 2 games of the preseason. That's just Terry Stotts and the staff trying to get a look at every single person. Obviously not even remotely indicative of what the rotations are going to look like, which is kind of unfortunate because I think it's something that I'm really curious about, is how exactly playing time is going to shake out for a lot of these guys, and you don't get a great sense of it. But the most notable thing that's happened so far in preseason has been the massive emergence of Harry Giles. Harry Giles' hype train has left the station. It is flying away. Maybe it was in part because it was against his old team, but Harry Giles looked incredible in these first 2 games. I think 14-13 in the first game and then 19-13 in the second game. Obviously playing about 25 minutes per night. He was hyper efficient. He was active. He was a good passer. He looked good on defense. I mean, he looked really good. He looked really, really good. This isn't just a scouting the box score type thing. His box score looks really good. And then just watching highlights or watching the game in general, you could see the appeal of this guy. And Giles, for the record, before I kind of pour a little cold water on this, which is what I'm going to do, but Giles isn't some unknown guy. He was a lottery pick. He was actually traded for Zach Collins in a way. The Blazers traded away the pick that became Harry Giles to get the pick that they used to take Zach Collins. So these two guys were traded for each other. But Giles coming into Duke was the highest. He was the number 1 ranked recruit in his high school class. Like, we're talking about a dude who was considered the best high school player in the country in his class before he went to Duke. Then he suffered a ton of injuries. Then he got into the NBA and then he suffered more injuries. And then his performance on the court hasn't been great. It hasn't been that bad either. It just hasn't been great. And I think Sacramento kind of bafflingly just moved on from him. I don't really understand why they have a lot of young bigs, and I guess they just didn't think he was good enough to crack that as group of big men that they have. I disagree with that premise. Maybe there was other factors at play that we don't know about necessarily, but the Blazers snapped him up really quickly, a guy that obviously they probably had some interest in heading into that draft and certainly have some interest in now. And yeah, like I said, he's looked great, but I think there's a lot of people who are like expecting him to have this really big role. And a lot of people who are like, well, he's going to play over Zach Collins and Zach Collins is going to be hurt. Here's the deal. Yes, maybe he'll play over Zach Collins, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But even without that, where do you see minutes for him? Because I see Yusuf Nurkic playing 30 minutes per game. And that's conservative. 28 is maybe the low end of what Nurk plays, but I think let's say 30. I see Robert Covington playing 30 minutes. And I think most of those minutes are going to come at the 4. Yes, maybe a few of them come at the 3, but let's assume 30 minutes at the 4. Enes Kanter is going to play 18 to 20 minutes per night. That's all of your minutes at the center right there. And Carmelo Anthony, you bet your ass Carmelo Anthony's playing at least 20 minutes. And considering how unwilling the Blazers were to play Carmelo Anthony at the 3 last year, he is playing the 4. Melo's playing 20 to 25 minutes per night, and they're at the 4. And I think if Melo comes up to 25 minutes per night, that means Rocco plays a few of his minutes at the 3. That still leaves exactly 0 minutes to be played by anybody else at the 5 or the 4. So, I mean, there's just not a space for him. There's just not a situation where Harry Giles gets consistent minutes. Maybe he gets some garbage time. Maybe he gets a few minutes at the end of the half if a team's in foul trouble. Who knows? And then Zach Collins comes back. He's going to be back at the end of January, maybe mid-January. Let's assume end of January. And people say, well, Giles deserves to play over Zach. Sure, but neither of them are going to play. Like, I think that's the problem that we're running into. Now, obviously, I think there's really important caveats here. We're playing in the middle of a global pandemic. People get hurt. People are going to get sick. People are going to get exposed to the virus. There's going to be opportunities to play. And I think that was the initial reasoning behind the Harry Giles signing, was just having more depth. Last year, the Blazers got really into their depth in the front court really early, and they bit him in the ass that they spent like real actual money on Anthony Tolliver and Mario Hezonja and Pau Gasol, who didn't play at all, and the other guys might as well have not played at all. And so this year, and Scalabissiere, I forgot about him. And so this year they were like, okay, we want legitimate depth. And Zach Collins has now kind of earned that injury-prone moniker, whether that's deserved or not. I think it's more deserved for Giles, but at the end of the day, Zach Collins is going to miss time this season with an injury. It's not the same injury he missed time with at the start of the year last year. That kind of makes the guy injury-prone. That's kind of just the reality of the situation. Yusuf Nurkic just coming off massive surgery. Harry Giles has been hurt every year that he's been in the NBA. So there's some, I don't think that their depth is like, when everybody's healthy, their depth is ridiculous. But it's hard to bank on everybody being healthy. Cantor's been remarkably healthy for his career, but he's not super young either. So I really like Harry Giles. I like the signing. They signed him for the vet minimum, which is hilarious that a guy this young and with this much raw talent who's healthy right now signs for the vet minimum. That just kind of seems insane to me. But I don't see him carving out a spot in the rotation. I think some of you out there might think that he's going to play over Enes Kanter. That's going to take a while. The Blazers did not bring Kanter in to immediately be the third string center. I think if Giles continues to play really well in practice, plays really well in the spurts of game action that he gets, and Kanter struggles, then I think that Giles could end up taking some of those minutes. And I also think that that's entirely possible. Like, I'm not saying that as some dismissive, like, oh yeah, if all of these things happen, that could very realistically happen. Kanter's very solid, and I think he's one of the better backup centers in the league. And certainly when he was in Portland 2 years ago, he was like one of the best backup centers in the league, and then stepped into a starting role and looked incredible. But he's getting a little bit older, and Giles looks really good. And I think there's a possibility that he ends up playing ahead of him later on down the line, and could be ahead of Zach too. But for right now, I think that fans who have been so enamored with Giles through these first few preseason games, and if he has a few more solid preseason games, are going to be real disappointed when after the first 2 weeks of the NBA season, he's played like 14 minutes. And I'm sorry, but that's really what I think is going to happen. Hopefully that's because Kanter and Nurk and Rocco and Melo are playing really well and are soaking up good minutes. And the Blazers are, won a lot more games than they lost. I think that'll make it a little bit easier to stomach, because fans will be like, well, we're playing well. All our guys are healthy. And if somebody gets hurt, we got Harry Giles, and he's been really good. So that's kind of how I see it. The Blazers haven't had this just embarrassment of riches in a really long time. Depth has been an issue for this team for, certainly was a big issue last year. Before that, when they had that team with Kanter, when they acquired him and they acquired Rodney Hood, they had a good amount of depth coming off their bench that year too. But for this season, I think it's at an all-time high in both the front court and realistically at the wing. And when Zach's healthy, they're going to have way more guys than they have room to play. And that could cause some problems. It'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. As a Zach Collins fan, as a Gonzaga alumni and fan of that program, obviously, I'm rooting for Zach to bounce back. I think that Blazers fandom is really down on him for a really small sample of not being exceptionally good. He, didn't look great in his first few games, but he was adjusting to playing a new position at the NBA and his new job as a starter. He got hurt in his third game, missed a year, basically. Came back. He didn't look great in the bubble. I'll admit that he didn't. But again, he didn't even get a chance to get his legs under him before he got hurt again. So I think that the fandom is too low on him right now. And I think that people who want to trade him or think that they should just get rid of him and abandon ship are being way too overreactive. Having said that, I don't think it's crazy that Zach comes back and plays well and still gets beat out for playing time by Harry Giles. And if that happens, it's going to be a real interesting situation for the Pinwheels. What are they going to do? Do you try to trade Zach Collins when his value is really low and when he's towards the end of his contract? Do you try to maximize trade value for Harry Giles, a guy you signed for virtually nothing? Do you just hold on to everybody and hope that egos will kind of step aside for the greater good of the team? Do you try to move Enes Kanter? Like, they have a lot of interesting situations that they could potentially find themselves in. I think that, again, more than any other year in the history of the NBA, having depth is so crucial for this season. And I think that they're going to try to do their best to hold on to it, because you don't want to risk, trading away, like they traded away Scala this year and then could have really used him later in the year when they had more injuries. So I'm kind of hopeful that the Blazers will be smart about that, because they really realistically have like 11 guys who could play good minutes on any given night, and they're not going to have enough room for all of them. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that shakes out. Kind of last topic was the Carmelo Anthony situation. We did see him come off the bench in these games again. Everybody played 25 minutes per night, but I do think that's about Melo's role. So I think we kind of saw like a lot of players were playing way out of their role. CJ Ellaby played a bunch of minutes. He's not going to play at all. Like I said, Keljin Blevins, I already forgot his name. He played 25 minutes per night. He's not going to play at all. So Anthony Simons, and then he played, and then obviously I don't think he's going to have nearly as big of a role. So a lot of guys were playing outside of what they're actually going to look like this year. Even Giles is in that camp as well. But Melo, I think we kind of saw what Melo's role is going to be. And in the first game, he looked great. He scored 21 points in 23 minutes. He was making good passes. He was taking good shots. He had a really nice block in transition. He looked incredible. And in the second game, he looked incredible, except that he was missing his shots. And that's the difference. That's the difference with Melo. He still took good shots. He still made good plays. He still seemed to be engaged and interested in the offense and running the offense correctly and getting to the spots that he wanted to get to. He just missed shots. That happens. That's fine. I think people will look at those two games and be like, this is kind of the best and worst of Melo. And it's like, if this is it, if he does everything right and some games he just misses shots, that is awesome. That's great. You'll take that from Carmelo because he's going to miss shots. Carmelo Anthony's missed a lot of shots in his NBA career. But if he embraces the role that he has, and it's so key. I think the decision to start Derrick Jones Jr. over both Rodney Hood and Carmelo Anthony, I can see why some people might have had some skepticism with that, because Derrick Jones Jr. is not nearly the offensive player as either Hood or Melo. He's probably not as good of a player overall as those guys, although it's kind of hard to compare them because they're such different roles. And a lot of people saw Covington as kind of the defensive-minded forward and like, well, we don't need Jones Jr. to also start alongside him. But this is really the Blazers going back to the Mo Harkless, Al-Farouq Aminu kind of setup that they had. Neither Chief or Harkless were great scorers. They're bad three-point shooters, and they just weren't great at creating their own shots. It wasn't really their MO. But they were really good defensive players. Chief was one of the best defensive guys that the Blazers have had in a really long time. And Harkless was super long, super athletic, super bouncy, and worked hard on defense. And I think the Blazers kind of wanted to bring that back. So they got Robert Covington, who's, an all NBA caliber defensive player, has been in the past. I'm not sure that he still is necessarily. Derrick Jones Jr., who's a freak athlete and a very, very good defensive player. And they said, we're going to put those two guys in the starting lineup, so that Dame and CJ are going to do all the scoring anyway. And then when they're not scoring, they're scoring. So we don't need guys who need the ball in their hands. We don't need guys who need a lot of touches. We need guys who play lockdown defense, because Dame and CJ are not that. And we need guys who can shoot open threes. And I say shoot open threes and not really make open threes, because Covington shoots a lot of threes. He shoots a lot of threes, but he's like a career 36% three-point shooter. So he's not elite as an outside shooter. Derrick Jones Jr. shoots less than 30% for his career. But the Blazers kind of run an offense of like, they obviously run the high pick and roll with Nurk, and most of the possessions are going to involve Dame, CJ, or Nurk shooting the ball. But when it's not, it's going to be those guys hacking up open threes because Dame or CJ are drawing the defense away. Those guys may not shoot incredibly high percentages from downtown, but you need them to shoot. Get them open and let them shoot. Some games they'll get hot, some games they maybe won't, and that's fine. That's okay. You can deal with that. We saw Blazers games in the past where the opposing defenses refused to guard Al-Farouq Aminu because he's not a good three-point shooter. And sometimes he torched teams because of that. Occasionally it happened, and that's kind of what you expect here. Robert Covington's not going to be an elite scorer for this team. He'll get his points occasionally, but on the off chance that he hits his first 3 threes in a game, that's devastating for the opposing team to have to figure out how to handle it. And then to get back to my actual point about these guys, what it does, allowing both those two guys to start, not only does it help the perimeter defense in the starting rotation, which is huge, it also allows the second unit to have a really, really ridiculous offense. You have Carmelo Anthony at the 4 and Rodney Hood at the 3. You have Gary Trent at the 2, who looks like he's going to be a really high-level scorer coming off the bench. You have Enes Kanter at the 5, who is a offense-first center. probably have CJ McCollum running the one. That's typically how the second unit has gone. Anthony Simons could potentially be that guy. Maybe Rodney Hood plays some point forward. I'm not sure. But if you have a second unit that's CJ, Gary, Hood, Mello, and Cantor, first of all, that is incredible offensively. That's one of the best offensive second units in the league. It's very bad defensively, which is something that they're going to need to figure out. Trent is a good defensive player, but that's about it. Mello hasn't shown much interest in playing defense in a long time. Rodney Hood is okay, but he's not great. CJ's a bad defensive guard, and Cantor's a bad defensive center. So it'll be really, really fun to see that second unit, but I think you're going to see like scores go up in a hurry on both sides. But for that second unit, Mello's really the guy, obviously. CJ is an incredible scorer as well, but in that second unit, he's going to be asked to be a facilitator. And I think if he's in that role, then the points are going to Mello. He's going to be getting the ball on the paint, and there's going to be a lot of teams that they play this year that they cannot handle Mello in the post. He's still good enough that especially against like second units, power forwards, backup power forwards in this league, most of them are either not going to be fast enough to handle Mello and he's just going to go around them and jab step them to death at the 3-point line, or they're going to try to put undersized threes on him or even undersized fours on him, and he's just going to bully them in the paint. Mello can still do that. He proved it last season for the Blazers. He proved it in the first preseason game. He even proved it in the second preseason game, even though his shots weren't going down. He was taking good shots. And I think he's going to be such a key piece of that second unit. And I think, too, we talk about starters versus backups. And Mello, yes, Melo's not a starter, but I guarantee you the last 5 minutes of a close game, the five on the court, Derrick Jones Jr. is not going to be one of them. But Carmelo Anthony is. And Rodney Hood might be too. It depends on what the Blazers need. But Carmelo Anthony will be one of the five people on the court at the end of basketball games this season. I promise you that. And I'm really, really excited to see what he's capable of doing. All right. That is going to do it for me today. So excited to get to talk Blazers next week. We're going to do a big preseason preview of them, even more so than what we've already discussed with their season just about to kick off. We'll obviously have some recaps of the Seattle Seahawks game against the Washington football team. Might even get some Mariners talk in there next week as well. So definitely stay tuned. I look forward to getting the chance to talk to you all then.
It's the Worldwide Sports Radio Network.